So Madison, that's James Madison, one of the framers of the Constitution.
I've heard that name, yeah.
So this is according to Madison. If there was going to be a Constitution and a United States of America, the Federalists had to respond to Mason's, Henry's, and other Southerners' assertions, quote, that the federal government would, in one way or another, render the militia impotent as a slave-controlled device, unquote. Representative Lambert Cadwallader of New Jersey, therefore, hoped that Madison's amendments would, quote, calm the turbulence of the opposition in Virginia and some of the other states, and certainly bring North Carolina into the Union. She goes on to say, the Second Amendment was thus not some hallowed ground, but rather a bribe, paid back again with black bodies. It was the result of Madison's determination to salve Patrick Henry's obsession about Virginia's vulnerability to slave revolts, seduce enough anti-federalists to get the Constitution ratified, and stifle the demonstrated willingness of the South to scuttle the United States if slavery were not protected. Actually, I think the Second Amendment is disgusting. I think it should be absolutely repealed. It should never have existed, and it has resulted in the perpetual slaughter and murder of so many people throughout the history of this country. Fuck the Second Amendment so much. And Congress well regulating the militia to round up people who are owned by other people, to quell them from revolting against their oppressors. Okay?
So that's what it's Congress.
You think I'm kidding? Oh, no. It's about protecting the people from the government and from a corrupted government, right? This desirable uniformity can only be accomplished by confiding the regulation of the militia to the direction of the national authority. It is therefore with the most evident propriety that the plan of the convention proposes to empower the Union, quote, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Article 29, as penned by Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. So what they're saying is, your local state governments can go ahead and pick the leadership of your local militias, but the federal government will be in charge of regulating the training and deployment of said militias. That's what well-regulated means. The Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. So there it is, fam. That's the entirety of the Second Amendment. There's a lot of myths and there's a lot of varied interpretations of what that means. So I have kind of 5 of them listed here. General, this is the prevailing wisdom, I think. These sort of 5 things And I assert confidently that these are all myths, that none of these actually have anything whatsoever to do with what the framers, founding fathers truly intended. And we're going to prove this in this segment. But none of this has actually anything to do with what the Second Amendment really intended. So the first one is personal self-defense. That's myth number one. Myth number two.
It's a common belief. It's a common belief, but you're calling it a myth, and you're better be able to back that up because my grandfather's going to point his gun at you in personal defense of the Second Amendment for saying that that's a myth. Okay, so these are common beliefs. So, I mean, of the general public, but yes, you're going to explain why they're a myth.
I'm going to say it's a myth, but with one caveat, that it actually is for the personal self-defense, but for an elite, wealthy ruling class, and that's it. Basically, people who owned other people. But trust me, we're going to return to that in a huge way. But for your average working class, citizen, American, poor, whatever, no, it's not about...
Like when the Black Panthers started carrying guns, not okay.
Not what the Second Amendment intended.
No, it can't be.
As much as I adore the Black Panthers, I have many volumes on the Black Panthers here because they're such a huge inspiration to me. But anyway, okay. So that's only the first one. So number two myth of the Second Amendment: to defend against an invading army. There's a lot of people who do believe that it was like, hey, because it's a new country and, maybe the army wasn't really established. People need to be ready in case whoever came to invade. This is a myth of the Second Amendment. Number three, this is a big one. This one makes people run up on the Capitol on January 6th and then smear shit on the walls and think they know something. To hold a corrupted government accountable. This is not what the Second Amendment was about. This is a fucking myth. And we're going to prove it. Doesn't matter. Listen, I am all about the people collectively holding a corrupted government or any fucking power structure accountable. Trust me, I am so all in for the concept of the workers and the people collectively rising up against corruption and oppression. Fully.
But if you don't think
the Second Amendment is not.
Second Amendment doesn't give you that right?
It does not.
Okay, because my grandfather would think you're licking the boot of the government if you don't believe the Second Amendment protects you against a corrupt government.
And listen, I completely understand why he thinks that. It's trillions of dollars at this point have been spent to make sure that really decent people think that. Okay? But they're wrong. It's wrong. Myth number 4. Well, this is just the Second Amendment protects the First Amendment. Yeah, that's nonsense. That sounds good, though, don't it?
It sounds good.
Oh, man. Because, freedom of speech, right? Protection from religion, and, the freedom to make sure everybody's an evangelical Well, that's not the First Amendment either. That it's... That's a whole nother video. But the Second Amendment is not, and no one that framed the Second Amendment, Hamilton and these people, had any notions of the importance of the First Amendment when framing the Second Amendment. Completely separate document in a sense. Number 5, well, I have a Second Amendment right. Okay. Well, do you? And that's what's really relevant in debunk, number 5 is the importance of the well-regulated militia. Everyone's heard the well-regulated militia. You'll even hear Cenk Uygur and progressive media talk about, well, are you a well-regulated militia? But if you ask even those progressives and those people who are pro-gun control, who I'm not so much about pro-gun control, just that might trip you out at this point in the video if you're a right-winger who's even stayed this long. I'm not about taking your guns away necessarily. We'll return to that. But do you have a Second Amendment right? What is the well-regulated militia? What is that? We are going to cover that very specifically. Spoiler alert, Congress. So the last thing that I wrote here was, by explaining the actual intent, history, contextual reality of the Second Amendment, and I'll only add now that I didn't write in the note what the founding fathers meant and what they wanted and why they framed it, we will address and debunk, with that knowledge that I'm about to share with you, we will debunk each of these 5 myths. So, with that bold statement asserted, there's a couple passages I had highlighted in this really fantastic book called The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America by Carol Anderson, New York Times bestselling author of White Rage and One Person, No Vote. The second, and this is a real deep dive into the Second Amendment. So this is from page, the passage that I'm about to read are from pages 32 through 35. I'm not going to read all of it, but various passages from those pages. So Madison, that's James Madison, one of the framers of the Constitution.
I've heard that name, yeah.
So this is according to Madison. If there was going to be a Constitution and a United States of America, the Federalists had to respond to Mason's, Henry's, and other Southerners' assertions, quote, that the federal government would, in one way or another, render the militia impotent as a slave control device, unquote. Representative Lambert Cadwallader of New Jersey, therefore, hoped that Madison's amendments would, quote, calm the turbulence of the opposition in Virginia and some of the other states, and certainly bring North Carolina into the Union. Now, he talks about Mason and Henry and Southerners from Carolinas and Virginia wanted this Second Amendment thing in here. Well, they weren't going to agree with the Federalists, the people who wanted all the states under one union rather than a bunch of little separate nations. They were going to agree to join this with them, provided they put this in here. And if they didn't put this in here, they were not going to agree to it. Now, she goes on to say, the Second Amendment was thus not some hallowed ground, but rather a bribe, paid back again with black bodies. It was the result of Madison's determination to salve Patrick Henry's obsession about Virginia's vulnerability to slave revolts, seduce enough anti-federalists to get the Constitution ratified, and stifle the demonstrated willingness of the South to scuttle the United States if slavery were not protected. So why would the actual... Why is that so important to them? Is it just because they want to own people so bad? Because it talks about, if you remember, in the Constitution, or in the amendment, it talks about for the security of a free state. This is what they believed. The adding this is what secured the very foundations of what America was. Now, I know every right-winger will agree with that, but they're not going to like what those foundations are. So it goes on. The question of the role of the militia was key to all of this. While Article 2, Section 8, Clause 15 and 16 of the Constitution delineated the role of Congress in calling out the militia for a variety of tasks, executing the laws of the nation, repelling a foreign invasion, and quelling domestic insurrection, it was the latter that was crucial for the second. The quelling of domestic insurrections.
I think modern conservatives would agree with that. The black terrorists, these horrible people in the ghettos. We need to keep our guns because all those illegal guns are out there. So they have their
BLMs, right? The BLMs and the Antifas.
They're just going to reinterpret it for their without trying to. I mean, it's racist, but they have, they're trying to make. Give their evidence for it. What about
Kylie,
black on black
crime? Here's a question that might make a lot of liberals uncomfortable. Maybe they're not actually misinterpreting it. Okay, so I know that is an incredibly bold claim as well. Allow me to read on. As for repelling a foreign invasion, the idea had already been disproved. George Washington knew all too well how ill-equipped the citizen / farmer / saloon keep / blacksmith militiaman was to confront a professional army. There were far too many times during the War of Independence when the militia would not show up, would run away, or would decide to just go home in the middle of a battle.
I thought the militias won the Revolutionary War for us. Like, we have to be grateful to them.
Now, that was a standing army. That was the actual Washington's army.
Oh, okay, the militias
did that.
Okay.
Right. And the army wore uniforms, right? Matching uniforms. They got, check this out, vaccinated. Google Washington's troops vaccinations. There was a whole, and they got proper training and for what that's worth at the time, right? But then the militia was just whoever it was from the local community, they could ask to come up and join the fight, right? And sometimes I'm sure that was very reliable and they fought hard and really good people fucking fought hard and bled and maybe even lost their lives in that effort. It's not to say that every militia member was, a piece of shit deserter, but, at least according to this, and she's well sourced, and you can go ahead and get a copy of this book because every claim that she makes, she sources, with actual historic documents and stuff in here. But I've seen stuff in times when I took political science classes in early American history where the militia was not reliable. That was well known at the time, that we can't rely on it because they're not actually beholden to the generals and stuff, right? Anyway, it goes on to say, it was obvious, whether north or south, that no militia was going to stop a foreign invasion. That was proved that the war proved that beyond a reasonable doubt. What the militia could do rather well, however, as George Mason noted, was keep slave owners safe. The Southern militias not only quelled rebellions, they were also there to prevent another Stono. They oversaw the slave patrols and regularly searched the homes of the enslaved for weapons. Georgia even upped the ante with a, quote, standing warrant to search any black's house, unquote, enslaved or free, for offensive weapons and ammunition. In short, James Madison, the Virginian, knew that the militia's prime function in his state and throughout the South was slave control.
Wow. Even in we're talking 1776. We're not talking the 1870s. We're not talking Civil War era. This is 100 years before the foundational time of our country, when they're trying to sort through laws, get this Constitution together, barely had their Declaration of Independence, and this is their daily life. I mean, this is their rationale for, coming up with these laws regarding an armed forces or standing army versus, how reliable the militia is. I don't know. It just goes to show how prevalent slavery was within the foundation of our country, and it was absolutely intentional and worked in that slaves did not have rights and they needed to be controlled.
Absolutely, and that, where I am really focused more so, when I bought this and read it, and what I highlighted and stuff is really, really about the slave patrol function of the Second Amendment. Her general thesis really is about how she really goes into great depth and detail about how also, even though it's about empowering and arming the average white supremacist slave owner and just average person to get their shit to go and round up an enslaved person if they escape those bonds, or to quell off of slave uprising, which we're about to get into in the next segment. But it's also about disempowering Black people, making sure, like this last passage that I read highlighted, that standing warrant to search any Black's house, enslaved or free, for offensive weapons and ammunition. So it's also about making sure that no Black person has any type of weapon or anything to protect themselves. So this notion of personal self-protection. Wow. Remember when I said originally it's about, well, it depends on who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, we're not going to go into a whole lot of in-depth detail about the massive, extensive efforts to disempower and disarm Black people. And she takes it all the way through, up to, the Civil Rights era and Black Panthers and stuff like that too, right? But it's important to note that that's a reality, and maybe you, as a viewer, could go down that rabbit hole yourself. Maybe we'll make another video about that another time. But what I'd really like to get into now, unless you have any other thoughts about where we're at right now, I really want to get into the nooks and crannies of the specifics of the slave patrol. So I guess I'll just cold read it. So thus, despite all the self-congratulatory kudos for civilizing Africans and trying to anesthetize whites with the myth of Black docility and complacency, Southern plantation owners actually understood not only that slavery bred insurrection, quote unquote, but that those revolts threatened the entire social structure of white Southern communities. The planters responded to this challenge by adopting a three-part strategy to break the will, or at least the ability to fight, of a people who had been snatched from their homeland and brutalized, and who were overwhelmingly, quote, hostile to those who controlled their labor, unquote. In a series of moves that would scar the United States well into the 21st century, colonial Virginia deployed this triad of brutal control. It denied the enslaved the right to bear arms, ignored the right to self-defense for Black people, and put in place a, quote, large-scale military machinery, the militia, to crack down on any conspiracies or uprisings. And if that's not concise enough, that recognition And the resulting fear, however, did not stop the mass importation of kidnapped Africans, who by 1710 already outnumbered whites in South Carolina. Instead, the response was to double down on the brutality and other measures necessary to ensure control of what would eventually be 57.5% of the total population. From 1671 to the early 1700s, the colony worked mightily to build, adjust, and then overhaul its slave patrol guidelines until it had effectively turned its white population into a community police force. The deputizing of all white males and the attendant increased slave patrols were supposed to promote white community safety. Now, I'm going to go into the Federalist Papers in the next section because we're really relying on her words and then the little number at the end of the sentence that notes where you should go back in the bibliography and look it up yourself. And so I want to make sure that we get into this in the Federalist Papers. But, Kylie, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, you're reframing my understanding of history here. And that's good. So, again, I'm kind of stuck up on the difference between the, I call them armed forces, a standing army, and then the founding fathers or the leaders of that era, knowing the militias were different, could be used, side by side with the standing armies, but had a better use in their communities to suppress a people, be enslaved. And another thing that comes to mind is like the enslaved were the majority. Like,
isn't that shocking?
Yeah, and I feel like I've heard that before when I lived in New York and I went to some museums. Like, New York was built on the backs of enslaved people, and look who lives in the best parts of New York versus not the best parts of New York City, right? And that was normal. And it was, I think some phrase used in one of the museums was New York is the epitome of how justice is not synonymous with freedom. Sorry. Progress? I don't know. I'll have to look it up. I'm sorry. But anyway, the freedom did not exist for the people who built up New York, but that was their creed. That was what they wanted. They wanted freedom from their oppressors, but in return oppressed other people. But anyway, I'd be interested to know if and when. I mean, we're always told whites are the majority, or we've always been told, we're going to lose. But look at this time frame, the enslaved were the majority. So either they killed them off, or I don't. It's just, yeah, it's really upsetting.
So I have two thoughts on that. So like first and foremost, that there's a reason these white plantation owners were fucking scared that they would rise up. There was more of them, and check it out, fam. There's also more of us than there are the capitalist ruling class. Okay? We're not brutalized in anywhere near in the same way as these enslaved people were at this time. While I'm making a comparison, I don't want to disrespect that reality, right? But there's way more of us than them still. But there's a reason they were scared, because they knew me and the other 15, 20 plantation owners and our wives and kids, each of us owns like 75, 50 people or whatever. If they got together and rose up against us, they would slaughter us in a second. So what we need to do is make sure that every white person has a gun in case anything jumps off.
Mm-hmm.
And let me emphasize, if anything jumps off. But
Right.
that's
Yeah.
where the well-regulated part comes in, right? Now, I know everyone's heard that thing about well-regulated militia, and they want to talk about, oh, you dumb militia guys. It says well-regulated militia. So, but you ask those people who call out right-wingers with that, okay, who does the well-regulating? Liberal. You know, you're so gloating and so full of yourself as you're insulting this dipshit right winger who does have it wrong, okay? But generally, you don't have it right. I'm gonna venture to say, with the exception of, there's gonna be people who watch this who do know who's supposed to well regulate the militia,
I don't know.
but the vast majority of you don't. Before today, did you have any idea? When you heard, well, what did you think of, Kylie? Let me ask you honestly. What did you think of prior to today when you heard that? Because you'd heard that term, right? The well-regulated
Yeah,
militia part.
but I just assume that they need to. A militia could still be like doomsdayers in the desert, or preppers in the desert, preparing for either the end of the world via apocalypse by natural disaster or by the US government takeover. Um, and they just needed to have an articles of organization to be well regulated. They needed a patch, maybe a matching uniform, as opposed to a clan, even though the clan had matching uniforms. But yeah, well regulated. I would just think they need, I don't know, yeah, an article, some kind of
Just
organizational
make sure.
document.
So basically, that they've spent a bunch of time uniformly crawling around in the dirt, and then they did jumping jacks the same way, and then they
They
said
had
the
the same
same
end
thing.
goal. Yeah, they had the
Right.
same allegiance or pledge of allegiance or whatever. That's what I would think. Who else would regulate them? They want to be militias. They want to be not non-regulated. But
And I think that's fair. I think anyone who's really spent time thinking about it, that's probably about as, I think that's a fair assessment. I don't think most people actually really think about that part. Even the people who are like, yeah, you dumb militias, where's the well regulated part? Not very well regulated. Well, it's now I'm gonna read specifically who's supposed to do the well regulating, and I want to say before I do that I'm an anarchist, and I don't want anything I do to be well regulated by Congress. Okay, so this is not an advocation necessarily. Actually, I think the Second Amendment is fucking disgusting. I think it should be absolutely repealed. It should never have fucking existed, and it has resulted in the perpetual slaughter and murder of so many fucking people throughout the history of this country. Fuck the Second Amendment so much, and fuck Congress well regulating the militia to round up people who are owned by other people, to quell them from revolting against their fucking oppressors. Okay?
so that's what it's
You think I'm
Congress.
kidding? Oh, no. It's about protecting the people from the government and from a corrupted government, right? That's what the 3%ers say. That's what, the Oath Keepers say. That's what Stuart Rhodes and all his fucking dipshits friends think. That they're the righteous protectors of America, and the Second Amendment enables them and empowers them to rise up against this government on January 6th. Okay? Well, it's fucking bullshit. Because this proves it. This is okay, so people who don't know what the Federalist Papers are, these are the letters from the framers and the writers of the Constitution elaborating on and explaining what they meant when they wrote the shit. Okay?
Yeah, the reason I know about it is when the Supreme Court was going through its, when the Supreme Court was mainstream media or in headline news, which Supreme Court candidates or justices were fundamentalists, and they were reading the Federalist Papers to understand what the foundation, what the founding fathers meant when they wrote certain laws that they now want to interpret per the founding fathers' intentions. Not modern interpretation, but what was. So anyway, so that's where I know the Federalist Papers win.
Absolutely. The Federalist Papers are fundamental and core to understanding the purpose and intent of the framers of the Constitution. Every constitutional scholar essentially has this memorized. Okay. You can't be a constitutional scholar. Actually, I would even go so far as to assert you can't properly understand the Constitution unless you have spent some time in the Federalist Papers. Okay. So what Hamilton says about the well-regulated militia, this is number 29 of the Federalist Papers. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. Number 29 is, it's about 8 or 10, about 7 or 8 pages. And that's a lot of text, all right? And remember, this is in Founding Fathers ease. This is in the vocabulary of that era. And so it's dense vocabulary, okay? But
well, can you put it in a rap? I might understand it or under.
Well, I think the section I'm going to read is going to be digestible, and we'll be able to talk about it and flesh it out a little bit. But let me read this section. I'm just warning you that it's a little dense, but we'll talk about it.
Okay.
Okay. So, the power of regulating the militia and of commanding its services in times of insurrection and invasion are natural incidents to the duties of superintending the common defense and of watching over the internal peace of the Confederacy. It requires no skill in the science of war to discern that the uniformity in the organization and discipline of the militia would be attended with the most beneficial effects. It would enable them to discharge the duties of the camp and of the field with mutual intelligence and concert, an advantage of peculiar moment in the operation of an army, and it would fit them much sooner to acquire the degree of proficiency in military functions which would be essential to their usefulness. This desirable uniformity can only be accomplished by confiding the regulation of the militia to the direction of the national authority. It is therefore with the most evident propriety that the plan of the convention proposes to empower the Union, quote, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Article 29, as penned by Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. So what they're saying is, your local state governments can go ahead and pick the leadership of your local militias, but the federal government will be in charge of regulating the training and deployment of said militias. That's what well-regulated means. Kylie, I mean, like I said, there's some big flowery dense words in there, but does it get any fucking clearer? Especially for any of these assholes who were running up on the Capitol on January 6th.
Yeah, so the Second Amendment, and really probably nowhere else in the Constitution, does it give any dissenters of the United States, or what would become the United States, authority to overthrow it, no matter how corrupt it was.
I would say it not in that way.
Not in that way. Yeah.
It doesn't empower them with weapons to do it. They do talk about there's that famous line, I believe it's Jefferson, who talks about, they make it, well, first of all, they have the amendments. There's your chance to ratify this document and change it, right? Mm-hmm. And then there is, the famous thing, I'm going to butcher the quote, but, at some point, this document will become so frazzled, it'll be time to rewrite it, right? So that's the provisions that they instilled to rise up against the corruption.
Yeah, that makes more sense. Why would the Founding Fathers put in the Second Amendment, people can rise up against us with guns? They're trying to secure a stable government, and within the context, I mean, if you were to reinterpret it the way conservatives interpret it now, the Second Amendment at the time should have given the power to rise up against a corrupt government to the enslaved, right? Because they were being oppressed and it was, unfair, and they were, being brutally tortured by authority, which is how modern day conservatives interpret the Second Amendment. We're oppressed by our government, we're taxed too much, we need to show up at the Capitol with guns, and so if you were to, transfer that back to the enslaved and the oppressed of the time, then you should know that that's not what was intended by the Second Amendment. It was definitely intended to continue to oppress the enslaved and not to give them power to rise up against their oppressors.